exam and SAC task this year. So looking at the study design, look in this area of study, students explore the different ways we can understand and read a text by developing, considering, and comparing interpretations of a set text. Another comparative aspect. You will first develop your own interpretations, analyzing how ideas, views, and values are presented, and the ways these are endorsed, challenged, and or marginalized through literary forms, features, and language. Nothing different so far. We develop our own interpretation. These student interpretations should consider the historical, social, and cultural context in which a text is written and set, very important to include our context, and consider their own views and values as readers. This is a bit of a new aspect because um, we will then move into exploring a supplementary reading that might enrich, challenge, or contest the ideas and the views, values, and assumptions of the set text to further enhance the student's understanding. For example, writing by teachers, scholarly articles, explications of a literary theory, critics' articles, and so on and so forth may be our assigned supplementary reading. A supplementary reading that provides only opinion or evaluation on the relative merits of the text is not considered appropriate for this task. So we're not reading reviews of how good is this book, guys. We want a kind of analytical piece or a discussion in terms of a literary theory, which oftentimes, yep, critics' articles are quite appropriate for. Informed by the supplementary reading, students develop a second interpretation of the same text. So this is our enhanced interpretation, and it reflects increased understanding of the text. They then apply this understanding to key moments from the text, supporting their work with considered textual evidence. So you will get a sort of prompt or question accompanied by a short passage from your text, and you will have to develop that enhanced interpretation for that passage, taking into account your own views and the alternate views from your supplementary reading to discuss an interpretation using evidence from that passage. And your prompt will ask you to discuss specific things. So it may be a theme that likely mentions in the prompt, and it wants you to base your interpretation around that. So it's quite a flexible and interesting and fun task. So we can see the key knowledge dot points for this area of study here. We need to be able to discuss context, ideas, views, and values, having an interpretation. From close reading and exploration, you will be zooming into specific passages a lot in your classes, lots of annotating and close study of texts, and in consideration of the text's context. So context remains very key. And then that second interpretation with the help of exploring a supplementary reading, the ways literary form, features, and language make meaning, nothing new here, and essentially stating that this has to be an analytical response. So nothing different from what we're used to. Similarly, it follows on in a sort of comparative structure just how the adaptations and transformations task did. So you might find this quite easy to do because there's comparative aspects from adaptations and transformations carrying on into this task as well. So basically, it's a new task for Unit 3 area of study 2, as well as now your section A of your literature exam, and this is for your new study design that is going to be going on for the next 5 years. Both sections of the exam have changed a bit, and it's quite a big study design change for literature, isn't it? So it's grounded in the literary perspectives task that has since been removed that I mentioned at the beginning of our lecture. in literary perspectives, students used to um, have to form an overall interpretation pretty much of their text based on a prompt, but a lot of their discussion and analysis had to circle around a chosen literary perspective, say Marxism, feminism, modernism, and so on and so forth, whatever was relevant to their text. So there would be a few perspectives pretty much you could apply to each and every single text that might have been appropriate to use as a basis for a discussion. You would read up on them, research them, find critics for them, and some good quotes from the critics to do that particular text. And then you would prepare for, a pretty wide range of different prompts that would have to your interpretation would have to center around while still discussing and analyzing everything in terms of those literary perspectives. Now, literary perspectives are still an optional aspect of this task. Um, Remember back to how we read that you might be using as your supplementary reading an explication of a literary theory. So you might, and especially depending on your school, it might be enforced that you still use literary perspectives. This is a great idea. I believe you should use them anyway. It will help you. It will only help you. If you want a very nice, all-rounded, fancy essay, and you want to have that amazing discussion of context, it is really easy to apply some kind of perspective, or not even apply a perspective for the whole thing, but just discuss in terms of a perspective for some of your essay is pretty valuable. It's not difficult stuff, guys. But hopefully a lot of your schools are still trying to teach some of the material about literary perspectives. It really is quite useful. But essentially, the task is quite a bit easier now, in my opinion, because literary perspectives was a quite challenging task. I'll be honest. And you would have to, of course, center a lot of your piece around a perspective. You had to have a very whole-rounded understanding of the perspectives that you may have wanted to employ and be able to use very specific vocabulary, have a lot of synonyms, pick out evidence relevant to the perspectives that you've chosen, and it was a lot of work. And I think this is a little bit more beneficial and more potentially more easy for students depending on how you find it. And it's an interesting task as well because it's a two-step process. You construct your own interpretation of a text based on, say, reading and discussion that you do in class. Then you interweave a supplementary reading, such as critics, with your own analysis in order to develop what is called an enhanced interpretation. So, like we said, some aspects of your supplementary reading you will use and say that they add to your interpretation, so you will agree with them. Some you will disagree, and in that sense, you will kind of argue, say, with the critic or whatever supplementary reading you have received. So it's a very interesting task. But this requires close study and analysis of your text, as well as close study and analysis of your supplementary readings. And this is likely to just be one, but it could be, more. So we have to quote from both our set text as well as critics in order to provide evidence for our interpretation. So this isn't required, as I mentioned, but I really recommend you quote from critics. It says it's not required, but maybe a few years from now with the study design, they'll mention something about quoting being better because I really find it difficult to. And if you think about it as well, it seems quite difficult that we're talking about the supplementary reading or our critics without quoting about it, and we're just bouncing the ideas around. It's not going to be as good of a piece, right? So just try to remember some quotes. Short quotes are easy, so if you're struggling, stick to short quotes. But basically, the developing interpretations task requires you to examine how others and you yourself respond to text and how textual evidences cause these views to emerge. So you need to remember back to the idea of your text as a construction. So the fact that the author's views, values, and messages will be inherent in the text, that the author has constructed the text to position the reader to respond in a particular way, that this is often intended to agree with their views and values. However, we will all interpret and respond to the text in different ways, and this is why this task is so interesting, um, because we're likely to find that we don't agree with a lot of ideas of other students or supplementary reading, and we might get the opportunity to recognize how different these ideas can be. So, pretty much, so long as you or any critic can explain and substantiate their own interpretation using textual evidence, their reading is correct. Just like how when we do this in essays, our reading is our interpretation is correct if we can justify it. And we had a chat about that today.